Hey everyone, and welcome to Bright and Early, the podcast for people building early stage startups. I'm your host, Brian Ray. I talk to entrepreneurs, product people, designers, and marketing pros to learn what works, what doesn't, and why, giving you at least one thing to apply to your business first thing tomorrow. My guest today is Darren Murph. Darren is head of remote at GitLab, where he is working to empower more people and companies to go remote, implement better ways of working, and equip his team with the tools and processes they need to thrive in an officeless environment. Darren, welcome to Bright and Early.
Thanks for the intro. Thanks for having me. This is my favorite topic, so I'm excited to be here.
Well, and that's why I'm happy to have you here. So this will be, I don't know when maybe 7 or 8, I think, in this whole like remote work series that I've been doing. But to have the head of remote at GitLab, 1,100 plus employees, right?
Yeah, you know what? As of today, we just tipped over 1,200 plus.
Okay,
so another
1,200 plus employees. There is no office anywhere. Is that right?
That is correct. We have legitimately no offices. If you look up GitLab on Google Maps, you'll find an address in San Francisco. And I kid you not, people do this. They'll go to the quote unquote office and they're extremely disappointed that it's just a UPS store. There is a mailbox in there where we get our taxes. And that's it. It's just a UPS store. So if you want to have coffee with the CEO, you either have to go to his apartment or find a Starbucks like everyone else. But yeah, no offices anywhere, no warehouses, no offices that we don't really use a lot. Legitimately, no offices. Pretty impressive.
Yeah. It's extremely impressive, and I mean, just a fascinating thing to think about, that a company of this size probably going to go public in the next.
That's absolutely the goal. So we're super transparent, and we've been transparent about that being the goal. And you can find out more about that in the handbook. Yeah, that's definitely the goal.
And so a company of that size about to go public and no headquarters, no office anywhere. What have been some of the biggest challenges of having a team of this size, company of this layers of complexity that is fully distributed?
Yeah, so we're the world's largest all-remote company. And on the road to going public, if and when that happens, we will become the first in the world to ever do it. And it's really amazing to be a part of history. And I think this will just be one of many to come after. I think we're a little bit ahead of the curve pioneering it, but I think we're on the cusp of this being a wave. The biggest challenge of having a team this size with no offices is empowering people to truly, earnestly believe that they can give themselves permission to drop any prior organizational baggage that they had and truly operate differently once they get here. Because there is no baseline to how we're doing this. We're writing the book on how it's done. And so if you're coming from a co-located space, a 20-year career in an office, there are certain norms, certain bureaucratic principles. These kinds of things are driven into your head from as far back as high school and university. Yeah. And it's just kind of how the world works. And the biggest challenge is getting people to come to GitLab and delete all of that and really invest in reading the handbook on how we do things differently, because many of these things truly feel like a trap. Some of these things would actually get you blackballed or maybe even terminated or outcast at a typical corporation. But
the things that GitLab encourages people to do, that they have been trained that this is not. So what are some specific examples of those?
A great one is blameless problem solving. So if you look at our values page, some of the values, things like collaboration, iteration, results, you may have heard those terms at other places, but if you look at the sub-values beneath them, so the sub-values serve to substantiate and explain and give context to what the values are. You'll find some amazing nuance in there that you will not find otherwise. So blameless problem solving is a great one, where the entire team is empowered to solve everyone else's problems collectively as a group, but blameless is the first word. So instead of, at a typical co-located corporation, you may see a situation where if something's going sideways, it's almost an opportunity for someone else to swoop in and take the praise and promotion at the expense of someone else. This is just kind of how we've been programmed, which is incredibly toxic and incredibly harmful to the organization at large. Right. So we focus on blameless problem solving. Like, let's just figure it out, get it done. There are no politics. There's no kind of who looks best in the office. Again, there is no office. Another amazing one that ties into that is a concept called short toes. So in a lot of organizations, you'll hear, "Oh, I don't want to step on your toes," or "I'm afraid to make my opinion known on a certain project because I'm afraid I'll step on someone's toes." But at GitLab, we all have short toes, so it's not possible to have your toes stepped on, and it's just a much more liberating way to work.
Yeah.
And there are dozens and dozens of those, but when you stack them all up and add them all up, you end up with a transformational new way of working. And this way of working tends to work really well remotely. I think a lot of these could be also applied to hybrid scenarios and co-located scenarios, but you kind of get outsized benefit when you have no office and everyone's on a level virtual playing field.
Yeah. So as you were, and that was going to be my follow-up question, is that those principles that you're talking about, that would make any company better.
Yep.
It would be fantastic if any office, everybody in it had, quote, short toes. I love that. I love that phrase so much. Why is it, or what have you found about working remotely that makes those particular approaches to work a little bit more natural or more more possible, or is it?
Yeah, well, remote makes you do things that you should be doing anyway in a co-located space. You just have to do them more intentionally, more quickly, earlier on in the formation of the company. And that enables you to rally around it early on. You don't really have the opportunity to kind of band-aid it in the way you can do in a co-located space where you can just have meeting after meeting and build up tons of layers of bureaucracy around it. So yeah, it would benefit any co-located company to do it this way. And in fact, I kind of see that happening where a lot of companies that want to introduce remote the right way into a legacy organization where they do have office buildings, to do it well, you need to go remote first, which is essentially saying we need to implement remote best practices because it will make our co-located company stronger.
Documentation being one of those remote first best practices that, I mean, you don't have to, but you're going to have a bad time if you don't. One of the fantastic things about GitLab is you all are completely transparent. You have so much information that is published, your company handbook, and then even within like your different departments have their own handbooks. I would imagine that onboarding a new team member can be extremely challenging because there are, multiple novels worth of words. So as head of remote, how are you thinking through, here's how we get somebody on board. They know that all of this is there, but we don't want to just overwhelm them. How do you think through the communication of all of that documentation that you've created?
So if you look at our public page on the biggest risks to the company, one of them is losing the values that bind us. And this is something that I think about more often than anything else, because it goes back to that initial point of you have to make sure people come in and give themselves permission to do things differently. Because if you onboard at a rapid pace and you bring in all of these new people and they're bringing in a lot of other old bad habits, it can easily adjust the seesaw in the wrong direction over time. And so you don't want too much of that coming in without enough people on the other front saying, hey, this is how we actually do it. Right. The easiest and best way to attack that is at onboarding. And so I've worked really closely with our people group and our hiring and recruiting teams to make sure that the most pertinent information is surfaced as early as possible to kind of serve as that shock to the system of this is going to be different and it's okay. Because otherwise people are just going to roll into the GitLab onboarding as if it's any other onboarding process. And there is a lot of preconceived notions and assumptions that they'll just roll with unless they're shown something that's different.
Right.
So I would say GitLab's onboarding is probably the most comprehensive and intentional of any company I've ever seen. So our onboarding issue, which by the way, you can see the onboarding issue template. It's public in the handbook, so any company can copy and paste it.
I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes. Okay.
It's over 250 checkboxes, and it's organized by weeks. And the beauty of this is that it's completely unambiguous. It's very direct. You know exactly if you're done with onboarding or not, and everyone else does too. So your manager can easily pop in there and say, okay, there are this many boxes left. I see that we're a little behind in this area. Maybe I should reach out to them and figure out what's the holdup. At a normal, quote unquote, normal co-located space, you don't really have that transparency. So you truly don't know how onboarding is going. You just sort of look over at them and smile. And if they smile back, you think, great, everything's being absorbed. And you actually have no idea whatsoever. So being intentional about it enables us to see if this is hitting the mark, if there needs to be any assistance given. I'll point out two things that I love about GitLab onboarding. One is that we have an intentional onboarding buddy. And so we pair every new hire with someone that's been at the company for an extended period of time. And we try to let the managers choose someone and pair them with someone that has a specialty in an area that may be of particular interest. So a great example is if we're bringing someone in, they have 20 or 30 years in a co-located space. They've never worked remotely before. They may be great at Git. They may be great on the technical side of things, but the softer skills on how to actually work well remotely might be a struggle. Yes. So we would try to pair them with a remote veteran, somebody that has worked their entire career remotely and can answer some of those nuanced questions like, how should I set my monitor up? Like, why is my back hurting? How do I focus more if I'm trying to work in the home and I have other things going on? What is it like to join a co-working space and make the most of it? These kinds of things, you may actually feel embarrassed about asking that if you've had a long 30-year career, but you shouldn't be. So we think very intentionally about matching people with the right people and the right skill set to make them feel the most comfortable when they come in. And I think the other thing is, if you're used to a new hire orientation, we can simulate that virtually. We have a new Labbers channel, and anyone in there is welcome to just say, hey, here's a Zoom link. Let's get 30 people on the call, and let's virtually walk through this first week together, just like you would in any co-located space. And it's pretty amazing when you do things like that. You can actually connect with people on a deeper level than you could in a physical co-located space, because everyone has their own backdrops and their own diverse backgrounds, and everybody is joining from their respective countries and in the midst of the culture that defines them. You don't really have to check yourself at the door. Everything about you is behind you, and it invites some really amazing conversations that frankly aren't possible in a co-located space.
Yeah, that sounds really fascinating. Hey, so you mentioned the onboarding issue template. I'll be sure to link to that. I'll find it and link to it in the show notes. And so you said there are roughly 250 checkboxes. I'm just thinking through, some of those would probably be administrative, like so-and-so has filled out the right HR. Okay, yes. Yeah, they've filled out the right paperwork, whatever. Tactical or practical, like their MacBook has been delivered. They have this technology, whatever. And then the third maybe being like cultural, like some of the things that you're talking about. Does that kind of hit the main three?
It does. A good example is I actually built a getting started to a remote role guide within our all remote section of the handbook. So part of my role is to build out the all remote section of our handbook. And if you look there now, we have over 30 guides to how GitLab does remote. And you can just Google GitLab's guide to all remote and you'll find it. So how we see everything from working asynchronously to handbook first documentation to meetings, the getting started guide is something that I put together because I felt like people coming in, here's a one-stop shop to get grounded on how we feel about the high points on working remotely and how to get acclimated to that. So there are some cultural elements in onboarding that essentially help you get acclimated to GitLab, help you get acclimated to a completely officeless environment. And it just points you in the directions of the resources that we have, because there's no physical shoulder to tap. But the plus side is that we have 1,200 plus virtual shoulders that can be tapped with a simple click of a mouse. So it's pretty easy to find that information. And one other thing I'll point out about this is we actually let people onboard. So a lot of times you'll walk into a company and there's this grandeur around onboarding. And by the 5th hour of the first day, there's something that's on fire at a cubicle beside you, and you have to jump into work and help solve this thing with zero context on how the organization actually operates. You don't understand the org chart. It's an impossible situation, but it happens all too frequently. And so those checkboxes are actually divvied out by days and by weeks. And we give people an incredibly long amount of time to actually onboard and actually absorb this stuff, because we really believe that building a solid foundation ensures that you're going to be very happy here long term, and it helps contribute to our retention rate. Our voluntary retention rate is north of 85%, which is just completely off the charts. And a lot of it is because we allow
especially in tech.
Absolutely. And it's something we pride ourselves on, and we want it to be even higher, to be honest. And onboarding goes a long way in helping cement that.
Yeah, no doubt. So one of the other, common struggles we've been talking a bit about, how to work remotely, communicating, talking about some of GitLab's things there. Well, a really common struggle is loneliness and isolation, that remote workers commonly cite as one of their top challenges. So I'm kind of curious what's been your personal experience or the experience of some of your team members, just as far as the issues of loneliness and isolation are concerned.
What's interesting about that is the reason this is always a top cited issue in remote surveys is that the vast majority of remote right now happens in a hybrid remote setting. So you're asking people, are they lonely? And they work in a company where a subset of their colleagues go into an office each day and have a completely fundamentally different daily experience than they do.
Yes.
So by nature of that structure, they are always a second-class citizen. So you would expect second-class citizens to feel isolated and lonely. It's simply the way it is. Mm-hmm. The crazy difference is, in an all-remote setting, I see almost none of that. Sure, you can become isolated, you can become lonely, you can overwork yourself, you can forget what time it is and just get into a flow and just crank through it and never go outside and see anyone. You absolutely can do that. But it happens way less frequently when we're all virtual. We all feel like we're in the same office every single day. It doesn't feel like there's someone that is in a place we are not. That is the beauty of all remote. And we fundamentally believe 100% remote, all remote is the purest form of remote. But with the reality of a lot of companies cannot unwind all the way back to an officeless environment. So then the question becomes, how can GitLab influence those hybrid companies to make it as great as it possibly can? And it comes back to implementing remote first practices. So if you're going to have 8 people in a boardroom in a co-located space and then 8 people virtually joining, have all 8 people in the boardroom open up their laptops, look into the webcam so that on this call, everyone feels like they're a first-class citizen. And then what's funny is what's going to happen in the boardroom is everyone's going to feel super awkward and look around at each other and be like, this is a little bit weird, which is the forcing function you need to just get out of the boardroom altogether. It is weird. Why are you even in there? No one needs to be there. All 8 of you in the boardroom could be wherever you wanted in the world, happy and comfortable and joining in on this call. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but there's some truth behind it.
Yeah, for sure.
I would say one of the things that we struggle with more than that is operating handbook first. Okay. So documentation is often cited as something that is necessary to run remote well, but it's not just blanket documentation. If you just mindlessly transcribe everything and mindlessly document everything, it's complete information overload. There's no context behind it. There's no contextualization behind it. So we are very intentional about saying, let's work handbook first, not just document for the sake of documenting. So GitLab has a handbook that if you printed it out would be over 3,000 pages. And it is our ethos for everything. It covers process, it covers benefits, it covers everything. And so the way we work is very simple. If you're going to make a change or you're going to iterate on something, make the merge request, make the proposal to change it in the handbook first. And then once it's merged and it's changed, disseminate that information out via Slack or via email, carrier pigeon, however you want. But if it doesn't exist in the handbook, it doesn't exist. And that's a simple concept that companies need to rally around, where there can only ever be a single source of truth. And that's our biggest challenge, is ensuring that everyone embraces, hey, there's a single source of truth for this. We're not going to take any shortcuts and branch out and have conversations in other places. That's the biggest challenge for sure.
Are those conversations, if do you call them labbers? Did I pick up on that earlier? Like
GitLabbers or GitLab team members, yeah.
Okay, so if a labber creates a merge request for a particular part of the handbook, is that public?
It can be.
Okay.
It's public by default. You would need to have a really good reason to make it confidential.
Okay. So an interesting problem I could see arising there is, the internet's a little bit notorious for the comments sections. Do the comment sections on what should be an internal conversation ever present a problem?
Not really, because we've thought through that and we have a code of conduct, and it essentially says if the code of conduct violation hits a certain point in any of our merge requests or issues, we can make it confidential for essentially the mental health and the well-being
Totally.
of our own team.
Yes. Yep.
So we've only seen that really happen a few times, but in the event that it does, we simply do that such that the work can actually happen. We can't allow external sources to prevent us from working.
Yeah, for sure. I am curious. When I was talking about loneliness and isolation, I'm thinking about the state of remote work surveys from Buffer, Owl Labs, FYI, every year. Does GitLab run one of those internally, and to see what are the most common things that your remote workers cite as their challenges?
We do, and actually we're working on an external one as well, and with a slightly different slant, because asking someone if they're isolated as a remote worker isn't very useful. You need to dig a little bit deeper to understand what is meant by that. So if you just ask someone, are they isolated, and they say yes, that doesn't really help you get to the root cause. Like, what is their work environment? Are they in a hybrid setting? Are they in an all remote setting? What does that actually mean? Do they have the right tools? It can mean something different for everyone. We do survey our internal employees, and we're working on ways to do that more deliberately. I just joined the company last year, and so the whole concept of let's take an intentional approach to make sure everyone feels like they're working well remotely is fairly new, even to GitLab. But we do have some resources that I think are really special. We have a mental health channel on Slack where people can openly converse about anything related to that. And one thing that we implemented at the beginning of this year is we work with a company called PTO Ninja, and we use Slack for our informal communication. And we implemented this opt-in feature in PTO Ninja where the first working day of every month, PTO Ninja will send you a DM in Slack and say, hey, it's a new month. Have you considered what days you're going to take off from work this month? And if you don't feel like you can take any days off or you're not comfortable about it, please copy and paste this message into your next one-on-one with your manager and discuss it. So this is a company-wide approach to saying we want everyone to pause at least on a monthly basis and think about what they need to do to take care of themselves. And this is a nice forcing function to reduce isolation. It just makes you think about, hey, there's a world outside of work. What am I doing to engage in that? What am I doing to engage in my community? But it also encourages people to think that other people are thinking about other people. And it destigmatizes the notion of let's talk about where each other went on vacation. Let's share pictures of our kids in the parenthood channel. That kind of segues into what we use Slack for and how the way that we use it helps to battle isolation. So all of our Slack messages expire after 90 days. This is a forcing function so that no work happens in Slack. We do all of our work in asynchronous tools, GitLab issues, and merge request, because if you start a project in Slack, you can't ever query it. It's going to be deleted. Therefore, no one here will do that because they know they're going to want to query it and remember something that happened. So instead, what we use Slack for is purely informal communication. So we have this awesome parenthood channel, for example, where you can see people in there saying, like, hey, my 7-year-old's being cranky. They won't put their clothes on and go to school in the morning. Does anyone else have a cranky 7-year-old and some tips on how to solve this? Those are the kinds of things that we talk about in Slack. And it's amazing because I actually don't think you would get that level of intimacy at a co-located space. It would just be a little bit awkward to walk into a co-located office environment and start asking questions about how to get your 7-year-old more efficiently ready for school. But it's totally normal where we are because we can't use Slack for anything else. So we might as well use it for really awesome relationships and building bonds between people. So it's a simple thing where we just force the messages to expire, but it completely changes how you use the tool if that is in place.
Yeah, that's it almost struck me initially as counterintuitive, but it's actually really genius for a company like GitLab that documents everything, super transparent. And then when you said, and we expire everything after 90 days, like, what? That seems odd, but that makes so much sense, is that it forces everybody to remember this is not where work happens, y'all. This is not where it happens. Do y'all use email for internal communication at all, or what's your email policy basically?
Well, we have email because the world has essentially universally agreed to have it, but it's mostly for engaging with external parties outside of GitLab.
Yes.
Internally, we essentially never use it because there are very few instances where what you would say in an email couldn't be said in a merge request or a proposal in an asynchronous tool. Our tool stack really consists of Google Docs, Zoom, Slack, and GitLab, the product.
GitLab itself.
Now, I honestly don't even consider email part of the stack because it's only there as kind of a bolt on to the external world. And then essentially if anything happens in email, it's the burden of the person receiving it to then contextualize it and put it in the appropriate merge request or GitLab issue. So you never want to work in email or Slack or anywhere else if the end product is going to eventually end up in GitLab anyway. You always want to start where you're going to end if at all possible.
Yeah. So to hop back for a second, the reason I was curious if GitLab had pulled your team members on those common challenges is because I think you struck on something that it just seems so true. The remote teams that are most at risk of dysfunction, inefficiency, whatever adjective you want to attach to it, are hybrid teams
for sure.
Because of that second-class citizen situation that you mentioned.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people listening who will be on a hybrid team and don't have the quite yet the luxury that GitLab has of being remote first. This is where we're starting from. When you talk to people in those situations, what are the handful of couple of first pieces of advice? Hey, get it, start here, do this. What do you advise?
First of all, don't be discouraged and don't make a knee-jerk reaction and say no remote, we're just going to do purely office, because I'm a fundamental believer that some remote is better than no remote.
Okay.
I have worked my entire career remotely, and up until GitLab I was on a hybrid team the entire time. And for me, the ability to the flexibility and the autonomy that comes with being able to live and work where my soul is most fulfilled trumps everything else. It's more important than salary. It's more important than ego. It's more important than title. It's more important than anything. And so if you enable that populace to join your team, you're going to get some amazing candidates that you otherwise wouldn't get. So the first thing I would say is still do it. The second thing is go remote first in every way possible, even when it's awkward. So example, the boardroom, for instance, if you're going to have a Zoom chat, first of all, think really hard if you need that. Okay. So just because you do a lot of meetings in the office, I would actually encourage you to try to force all of those asynchronous as soon as you possibly can. Does this meeting absolutely have to happen? Or can I create something like a GitLab issue, tag the appropriate people in it, and then they can respond when it makes sense for them to respond? Because if you're going to have a meeting just to put what happens in the meeting in an issue, just do the issue first.
Just do the issue.
Just do the issue first. Like end where you're going to end. Like don't use meetings as a Band-Aid solution. Try to cut those out as much as possible. The second big tip is get the executives out of the office. If you have your executive team in the office, it sends a message to everyone else in the company that is the epicenter of power. That is the epicenter of where decisions are made. And it is extremely hard to overcome that. So even if it's just for a month or a quarter, get your executives out of the office. And what you'll find is that the communication gaps or the tool gaps or the process gaps will become immediately apparent. They'll almost solve themselves. Because if you have your execs out of the office, all of the information has to eventually go all the way up and then come all the way back down. And it will be obvious to the execs what needs to happen. And it'll also streamline your evaluation on what is needed versus what we already have. Instead of just kind of looking at what other companies do remotely, just do that and you'll solve it for your company. Because listen, the answer to this is different depending on how big your company is. It's going to be very different for GitLab at 1,200 people compared to a 10-person startup or 5
for
or
sure.
50 or 100. It changes dramatically at each one of these steps. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but the one-size-fits-all path to finding this solution is get the execs out of the office, even if it's just experimental. You'll then quickly find what you need, what you already have, so on and so forth. The third thing is hire a documentarian. There are a lot of former
Huh.
journalists that are looking for work, and these people would be amazing to come into your company with a journalist hat and just peer across the entire organization. And they know what needs to be documented. They are built to understand what stories need to be told,
Storytellers.
what matters, what doesn't matter. They can look across the organization and figure out what needs to be documented and in what order, and they can essentially start building what your handbook is going to become. So if you're a small enough team, just bring on one documentarian, one scribe, and just have them join everything and just start writing stuff down. And essentially, they'll tell the story of your company. They'll begin to see chapters forming, and they'll begin to see trends forming, and they'll be able to put this stuff together. The last thing is iteration is key to doing this. This is not a binary switch that you flip. This is not an overnight solution. Implementing remote, or quote unquote going remote, it's an eternal process. Even at GitLab, 1,200 people strong, there are new tools being created every day. There are new processes being created every day. We are on a constant journey of iteration to make it better and better and better and better. It's not like we have it all figured out, nor will your company. But be okay with that. There's going to be some hilarious communication gaps, some like massive fails that it's fine. Chances are, if you went into an office on the very first day, the key fobs didn't work, the elevator was stuck, like the food was cold, even your office wasn't perfect on day one, but you gave yourself grace and you committed to iteration, and it got better and more polished over time. Remote works the same way. You just have to be committed to it. If you tell your team that you're going to implement remote first practices, and then it becomes too hard or too complicated or too awkward after 6 months and everything reverts back, you've lost the team forever. Like, you've lost their trust forever, and no one's going to commit to helping you get there. So commit to it and do it. I'm a firm believer that it's not really a matter of choice. Every company is a remote company these days. If you're operating on 2 floors, the floors are remote to each other. If you're operating in 2 offices, the offices are remote to each other. You might as well get the remote infrastructure in place, because unless you're all in one room, like the smallest of companies, you're remote. And chances are, even in a company like that, you each get on BART or MTA or something like that. You open up your phone. Now you're working remotely.
Yeah.
It's time to be honest with ourselves that remote is everywhere.
Yeah. If you're hiring freelancers, contract work, outsourcing accounting, bookkeeping, you're already partially remote. Right. So how does GitLab approach company retreats, team retreats, summits, that sort of thing? Yeah,
it's interesting. A lot of people will say, I wonder if there's any value to in-person interactions at a company where there's no office. You seem pretty deliberate about never wanting to get people in the same office. And it's actually untrue. I think we're more deliberate and intentional about our in-person interactions than even co-located companies. So we understand that no one will ever see each other unless we are deliberate about making it happen. And we firmly believe that work happens better virtually, and personal relationships are better built in person. So we structure everything around that. We want to get people together, frankly, not to work. We want to get people together to get to know each other and build personal bonds, and then work virtually. That's way more efficient to do that. So every 9 to 12 months, we get the whole company together at a summit called GitLab Contribute. And we have an opening keynote, a closing keynote, and pretty much everything in between is external excursions where people can just go out, hike, eat, explore, get to know each other on a personal level. And then the relationships that are built there can essentially carry you through until you meet again. The other nuance is that we have to gather for things like sales conferences, the KubeCons of the world. We get subsets of the company together really frequently. And as a remote first or an all remote company, I would encourage you to support people joining those, even if there's not a great reason for them to be there. So a counter to that is, if you're at a co-located space, a lot of the times you have to have this long list of justifications of why you should join the team at CES, for example, because there's some expense involved in traveling there. But if you don't have to pay for a permanent office for this person, and there's some inspiration that they want to go see a team that they work with, but they've never seen them in person, and everyone else is going to be at this sales conference. Just let them go. I mean, this is
Right.
like build a culture around encouraging people to go see each other when they can. Another thing that we do that I love is we have this incentive called the visiting grant, where we will actually pay for $150 of your travel for each GitLab member that you go see. And we have no qualms about someone stretching out a 6-continent jaunt across 6 months to kind of hop from one team member to the next, and maybe see 50 people en route. Just keep the tab running. Because the truth is, most people don't have a lifestyle that's going to enable that, but it's more about the cultural implications of having that ability and just encouraging people to get out of their comfort zone, go travel somewhere far and go see someone else on the team that lives in a different country or different continent or speaks a different native language, and we'll help you pay for it. Because we believe that is a more naturally diverse and inclusive team than trying to manufacture diversity by hiring 2 people from every country and then bringing them to a single city, where at the end of 6 months, to be honest, they're going to be acclimated somewhat to wherever that new location
Strong
is.
point.
And they're going to lose a little bit of that culture they had to begin with. So, we have people in over 65 countries right now, and they are able to live there. Like, they bring all of that culture to work every single day. It's not manufactured. It's genuine. And there's no other way to do it. It's an amazing thing to work with team members across that geographic diversity.
You mentioned GitLab Contribute. That's an internal?
Yep.
Okay.
Right.
Summit.
That's right.
Does GitLab host a host an external conference or summit of your customers?
It's called GitLab Commit. We started doing those last year. We have done them at a few cities around the world. We did one in Brooklyn. We did one in London. We recently did one in San Francisco, and there are going to be more on the docket. So Google GitLab Commit, and you'll have our upcoming schedule. Our corporate events team is working hard on lining up what the next dates for those are going to be. But yeah, those events are amazing because it gets together a huge portion of the company that doesn't get to see each other in person very often. But it also allows developers and remoters and just people that are generally interested in either of those topics to come and interface with us and meet other people like them. And
totally,
they're in fun locations. And so we encourage it, and we encourage people to tack on trips around them. The last one in San Francisco, I came early and stayed late and did some hiking along the Northern California coast with my family. And that's what it's all about.
It's the
amazing.
best. Cool. What's I guess in your opinion, does remote work require more discipline?
Without question. It falls apart more quickly without discipline. So this kind of goes back to an earlier point I made, where in a co-located space, you can kind of band-aid your way around discipline by just engaging a torturous loop of meetings to continually bring a broader array of people up to speed. And it's like under the guise of that being work, but it's actually not. But you don't have the benefit of that meeting loop in a remote space. So you have to be more disciplined. But I want to make sure we don't color that as a negative. Like, it's not a negative that you need to be more disciplined at work. If you're more disciplined at work, you can leave work earlier and go do things you actually want to do, like hike and spend times with your family and cook and sleep.
Yeah.
Discipline at work means you're more efficient at work, which means you get your work done earlier and go do things like life. So it's a good thing, and remote forces you to do it.
Yeah. The way I was asking that earlier on in this series was, I can't even remember it exactly now, but it was basically like, do you think remote work is harder?
Okay.
And that's not quite the right word, but I like the way that you answered it. Yeah. It requires more discipline. That's a good thing.
Yes.
Yes. I feel like something that a lot of teams who decide to go remote, or just leap into it with like, oh, all the benefits, it's amazing. We have less infrastructure costs. We have no real estate. We can hire from anywhere. This is going to be amazing. And then you get into it and it's like, whoa, like with all these challenges that we weren't prepared for.
But isn't any of that different than the challenges you would have as a co-located team? I mean, look, GitLab grew so much last year that we would have had to have physically moved offices 3 times. And that's if we would have had everybody in one city instead of multiple cities. That's an abject nightmare. So dealing with remote challenges, they may look a little different than co-located challenges, but it's interesting. I think remote kind of takes the brunt of like, oh, it's hard to get right. It might seem harder to get right because there's no book written on how to do it. Like we're all kind of learning this as we go, but I don't know if that's necessarily more difficult or just society as a whole is still wrapping their head around what exactly it looks like and what exactly it means.
Yeah, it's well said. Well said. Darren, how can listeners find and follow you online?
I'm on Twitter at Darren Murph, Instagram at Darren_Murph. Be happy to chat with anyone on any of these topics. I love it. It's a passion of mine. It has fundamentally changed my family, and I want it for as many people as possible. And that's what GitLab is all about, helping to proliferate remote first and all remote companies. So be sure to Google our handbook. Feel free to copy and paste any of it. The way we do async, the way we do meetings, it would make us really happy if it works in your company. And if it doesn't, create a merge request, assign it to me, and let us know how we can make it better.
My guest today has been Darren Murph. Darren, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Okay, let's do some closing thoughts here. One really interesting thing to me was in asking Darren, what's the biggest challenge, and having a team of that size be fully distributed. It was like getting people to drop their old habits, or I think getting people to drop their baggage even may have been how he put it. And just all of the habits of, what we have come to think that work should look like, or patterns, routines, processes, and things that are most likely to happen elsewhere. Getting them to drop those things and really believe that you can operate in a different way at GitLab. That's pretty fascinating. The principle of blameless problem solving is so important, super difficult to execute, but so valuable. The colleagues, or my former colleagues at a startup from a couple of companies ago, we talked about this at the time and have talked about it many times after, that one of the greatest strengths that our team had was being able to just absolutely go after each other's ideas is not quite the right word, but just like in the moment, brainstorming and talking through an idea, being able to be to practice radical candor. That's another phrase and thought that is super helpful. To not take anything personally, and also to just be able to work through a problem regardless, without blaming anybody for having caused it, or without that even mattering. It doesn't matter. People are going to make mistakes. What we need to do in order to move forward is to be very honest, not throw blame and aspersions at one another, but to push through it. And we all kind of recognized at the time and afterwards that was just it was a pretty unique situation, that most of us had never functioned in quite that way and before, and had seen such a small number of people function so highly together and create something so fantastic. So I just really appreciated that piece of the interview. Also the term short toes, everybody having short toes. I love that. And being able to put an idea forward and not worrying about stepping on someone's toes, and the practice of, okay, I need to have short toes in this situation, not receiving somebody's input or feedback or an idea, and getting defensive about your little like your ownership stake, or your tidy little piece of the company, and somebody trying to move in on it. That's pretty fascinating. His thought around that GitLab's biggest threat is losing the values that bind us. Super interesting to hear somebody at a 1,200 person company say that. Like that is something that businesses usually start talking about at 30, and then again at 100 to 120, then 200 and so on. And so it is fascinating that issue or that problem is always there, even as you continue to grow. Certainly, a single hire can derail a company's values and culture, at 10. At 100, not quite as likely, although certainly still a threat. And at 1,000, the immediate effect is felt even less so. But those things compound and grow. So it's always something you got to be, keeping an eye on. And, onboarding is the place to head it off at the pass, so to speak, to address that problem before it has time to mature, and spread. And yeah, I'm going to link to the GitLab onboarding. It's an issue template. Because they use it. They use GitLab issues, the feature, to track them. But you could drop that yourself into a Google Doc, a Trello board, an Airtable database, however you might want to track it. And it is super extensive. And you could scale it up and down depending upon your own needs. But it is interesting and important how deliberate they are about onboarding remote employees. It makes me think of something that Darren was saying later in the interview, that with remote work, things fall apart more quickly, or issues become magnified sooner. And so, yeah, certainly the idea of needing to have more have operationalized onboarding sooner is probably more important for a remote company. You walk into an office and you can be, walked around the office, introduced to everyone. There's someone a desk or two over that you can kind of like, hey, what am I supposed to be doing over here? And that's more difficult when everybody is distributed. And so sure seems like onboarding, especially if you're at the point where you're beginning to make a number of key hires, onboarding for a remote company is super, super important. I think I liked the idea of saying of operating handbook first. That just seems like a really great principle. Something that's come up in these interviews very often is just the idea of a communication guideline, so that somebody can know, I have this type of question or request or piece of feedback. Where do I go to post it? Or I've got a new idea for a feature. What's the best way to think through this and share it with the appropriate folks? Like, what's that process? And so something that some people have emailed me about is like, because I've shared a few templates that are widely available. It's like, well, what should go in there first, and how much is too much? And it sure seems like just taking the approach of operating handbook first, and can this request can't be answered in the handbook? Well, there's your answer as to whether or not it ought to be added. And as Darren mentioned, like, don't mindlessly just document every single thing. Period. It's info overload. That having that as having that question or that principle as like the guide seems like a way to continue to strike that balance. So I thought that's a fascinating way to think through how to design, and where to start with your company handbook. Start with a basic outline, and then just as the days and weeks and months go along, as questions come up where the answer could not have been gotten from the handbook, well, there's your answer. And yeah, so in like final thought here, so I mentioned just a second ago, the question of, does remote work require more discipline? I like that. I like where that went, just in the sense of yes, but that's not bad. That's a good thing. it does require more discipline. Things will fall apart more quickly. Problems that you are likely to face in a co-located company, those same things will pop up for remote companies, and oftentimes they're magnified. At the same time, a lot of problems that would show up in a traditional office just aren't going to be, they're not going to be a problem. But those, tend not to be as, what's the right word here? Like, the things that don't show up for remote companies tend to be fringe concerns and interpersonal things at the office. But the core principles and components of operating a business, managing a product, building and designing a company, those same issues and questions and challenges are going to come up, and they're probably going to be magnified in certain ways. That is not bad. The good still far outweighs the pros far outweigh the cons in comparing the two. But you just gotta be prepared for it. So check out the show notes. Plenty of great links there. Thanks again to Darren for joining me on the show. And if you have any thoughts at all about this or any of the other episodes, please reach out to me. It's always fun to hear from you all. I am B-Ray on Twitter. It is BRHEA. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.